In the sands of Arabia, thousands of newborn girls vanished before they could even cry. Buried alive, erased from memory, their story was almost lost forever. Until one voice changed everything. When we imagine ancient Arabia, most people think of vast golden deserts, camel caravans gliding under the scorching sun, and tribes gathering around crackling fires under star-filled skies. It sounds poetic, almost timeless, but buried beneath that beauty lies a truth so dark, so painful, that it rarely finds its way into history books. A truth the desert itself has tried to swallow. For centuries, across parts of Arabia, the birth of a baby girl was not met with joy or celebration. It was met with silence, shame, and in too many cases, a shallow grave. Imagine this: a newborn's first cry, piercing the desert night, only to be hushed forever by the very hands that should have protected her. Tiny bodies wrapped not in cloth, but in sand. Lives ended before they even began. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a practice, a chilling ritual born out of fear, pride, and the harsh realities of survival in a brutal landscape. Female infanticide. The burying alive of newborn daughters became a scar etched into the fabric of Arabia's pre-Islamic past. But here's the part that history often forgets. These weren't faceless statistics. They were daughters. They had names whispered by mothers who dared to dream of raising them. They had futures that could have held love, laughter, wisdom, and strength. Yet all of that was stolen before their first breath was even complete. Why would a society choose to bury its own children? The reasons were layered. Some tribes saw daughters as a burden in times of poverty, another mouth to feed when food was already scarce. Others feared the vulnerability of women in a land marked by endless raids and wars, worrying that their daughters would be captured or shamed. And at the core of it all lay a culture of pride and misplaced honor, one where a son was celebrated as a defender of the tribe, while a daughter was too often seen as a liability. But while men carried swords, it was the women who carried the weight of this cruelty. Imagine a mother holding her newborn girl, heart pounding, knowing what fate awaited. Her tears soaking the infant's tiny face, her screams swallowed by the desert wind, her love powerless against the expectations of her tribe. The sand hid many secrets in those days, but none as haunting as the muffled cries of Arabia's forgotten baby girls. And as the years passed, those cries turned into echoes, whispers carried by history, reminders of a darkness that tried to erase half of humanity before it had a chance to rise. To understand the weight of this tragedy, we have to look closely at how it was done. This was not a rare act, committed in secret by a few. In many tribes of pre-Islamic Arabia, it became almost systematic. The birth of a baby girl was not a time for celebration. Instead, it triggered a decision that would determine whether that child lived or was erased. In some cases, the father would wait silently during childbirth. If the midwife announced a boy, relief filled the air, songs, laughter, feasts. But if she whispered, "It's a girl," the room grew heavy. The joy vanished. Faces turned pale. The family knew what came next. The act itself was cold and deliberate. Some fathers dug shallow graves in the desert before the child was even born, preparing for the possibility. The newborn, sometimes only days or weeks old, would be carried out into the dunes, wrapped loosely in cloth. Imagine the helplessness of a baby blinking against the sunlight, tiny fingers clutching the air, not knowing the horror awaiting her. Then the sand closed in, grain by grain. Her cries were muffled until silence reigned. Others killed their daughters in different ways, leaving them exposed to the wilderness, abandoning them to hunger, thirst, or wild animals. However it was done, the result was the same: a life stolen before it could begin. Why would entire tribes normalize something so brutal? The harsh desert environment played its part. Life in Arabia was unforgiving. Food was scarce, Water was priceless. Every child meant another mouth to feed. Sons were seen as future protectors and warriors, investments for survival. Daughters, however, were viewed as fragile, as mouths that consumed without contributing to war or defense. But survival wasn't the only reason. Tribal honor cut deeper than hunger. In a culture where raids and battles between clans were constant, fathers feared the shame of daughters being captured by enemies. A girl taken in war could bring dishonor not only to her family but to her entire tribe. And in a world where reputation meant everything, men chose to sacrifice their daughters rather than risk humiliation. Even the language of the time reveals this cruelty. Ancient Arabian poetry contains verses where fathers openly lament the misfortune of having daughters. Some even bragged about ridding themselves of the supposed burden. What should have been songs of lullabies turned into lines of justification for murder. And yet, in this darkness, imagine the women, the mothers, the sisters who had no voice to stop it. Their grief was swallowed in silence, their resistance crushed by tradition. They lived with a memory of tiny faces that never grew up, dreams that never blossomed, love that was denied a chance to exist. Female infanticide was not just a crime against children, it was a crime against humanity itself, a practice that robbed half of society before they even had a chance to speak. A scar so deep that even centuries later the very thought of it makes the heart ache. Behind every burial, behind every silenced cry, there was a woman whose heart shattered in silence. The fathers may have been the ones who carried out the act, but it was the mothers who carried the grief. They gave life, only to see it stolen. They held their daughters in trembling arms, knowing that love was not enough to protect them. Imagine the torment of a mother. Moments after childbirth, cradling her newborn girl, she whispers a name in her heart, a dream she dares not speak aloud. For a brief second, she feels the warmth of hope. But then the father's shadow falls across the room, and her hope collapses. She knows what is coming. Her protests are stifled. Her tears are hidden. To resist is to risk her own standing, perhaps even her own life. So she swallows her scream and watches as the tiny bundle is taken away. This was not a one-time pain. It was a cycle that repeated generation after generation. Women in Arabia carried scars that no one could see. Scars from giving birth, not just to children, but to tragedy. For them, motherhood was not only about love and nurturing, but about surviving heartbreak. To conceive a girl meant preparing to grieve. Some mothers tried to resist. Stories survive of women who clung to their daughters, begging their husbands to spare them, even offering their own lives in exchange. Sometimes they succeeded. Many times they did not. And when the sand swallowed their child, it swallowed their voice too. Think of the nights that followed. A mother lying awake under the desert sky, haunted by the echo of her baby's last cry. No funeral, no marker, no chance to mourn openly. Just an emptiness she carried alone. Her milk drying with no child to feed. Her arms heavy with absence. And yet, these women endured. They still bore more children. They still raised sons. They still played their roles in tribes that denied them power. Their resilience was invisible, but immense. While the men spoke of honor and pride, the women bore the weight of loss, quietly, endlessly. The tragedy of Arabia's buried girls is not only about the children lost, it is about the mothers forced to live with that loss in silence. Their tears never made it into the poems or the histories written by men. But their sorrow shaped the spirit of an entire society. It whispered in lullabies never sung, in embraces never given, in futures never lived. This is why remembering them matters. Because for every forgotten daughter, there was also a forgotten mother, her voice silenced, her heart broken, her story untold. To understand the cruelty of this practice, we have to ask a painful question. Why were daughters feared? Why were baby girls, innocent and helpless, treated as threats rather than blessings? The answer lies in the culture of pre-Islamic Arabia, where survival was hard, honor was fragile, and fear often disguised itself as tradition. The desert shaped everything. In a land where resources were scarce, and tribes lived in constant rivalry, every child was weighed not in love, but in usefulness. Sons promised strength. They could fight in battle, guard the tribe's wealth, raid enemies, and defend honor. Daughters, however, were seen through a narrow, distorted lens. They were considered weak, vulnerable, and dependent. Another mouth to feed. Another risk in a world already too harsh. But survival was not the only reason. Daughters were unwanted. At the heart of the fear lay something even more revealing: honor. In Arabia's tribal code, a man's reputation was everything. If a daughter was captured during raids, humiliated, or forced into slavery, the shame would not fall on her. It would fall on her father, her family, her entire tribe. To many, this potential dishonor was worse than death itself. And so fathers believed that burying their daughters was not cruelty, but protection. In their twisted logic, they thought they were sparing themselves shame by taking their daughters' lives. This explains why in poetry and oral traditions of the time, women were often reduced to symbols of burden or danger. Men wrote verses praising their sons' bravery, but spoke of daughters as shadows, weights, or threats to pride. In such a world, a girl's worth was measured not by who she was, but by the risk she represented. Yet, the truth is, these fears were built on illusion. Daughters were never the weakness. It was the society that chose to see them as fragile instead of valuable. In their hands could have been the future, wisdom passed down, bonds strengthened, families nurtured, but blinded by fear and pride. Fathers never saw the possibilities their daughters carried. And what about the mothers? They knew the truth. To them, daughters were not threats but treasures. They saw their softness, their beauty, their potential, but trapped in a world ruled by men and honor codes, their voices were silenced. A mother's love was not enough to rewrite the laws of survival and pride. The result was a society that celebrated half its children and buried the other half, a world where boys were raised to glory and girls were erased before they could even speak. This imbalance didn't only rob individual families, it robbed the entire civilization of what women could have contributed. It created generations haunted by absence. This is why daughters were feared, not celebrated. Not because of who they were, but because of what society chose to believe about them. And in that belief, countless lives were lost to the sand. For generations, the desert kept its silence. The cries of baby girls faded quickly into the sand, as if the earth itself conspired to hide the shame of their death. Fathers buried their guilt, mothers buried their grief, and the cycle continued, unquestioned, unbroken. It seemed unstoppable. But then, in the 7th century, something remarkable happened. A voice rose from within Arabia. Not the voice of a warrior, not the boast of a poet, but the voice of revelation. It was sharp enough to pierce centuries of tradition, bold enough to confront the darkest secrets of the tribes. And in that voice the buried girls were called back to the surface. It was the message of Islam, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And among its earliest declarations was a question so haunting that it shook the very foundation of Arabian culture. And when the girl who was buried alive is asked for what sin she was killed, for the first time, the silence was broken. Those muffled cries, forgotten in shallow graves, were given words. The newborns, who had no chance to speak, were now speaking through divine revelation, their innocence declared, their worth restored. Imagine the shock of a father hearing those lines recited aloud in the marketplace. Imagine the shiver down his spine as he realized the act he once called tradition was now branded a crime before God. This was not just a command. It was a revolution of thought. Daughters, once seen as burdens, were now proclaimed as blessings. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, didn't stop at condemning infanticide. He elevated the status of girls in ways Arabia had never seen. He said that raising daughters with kindness and patience would be a shield from the fires of hell. He promised paradise to the father who cherished them, to the mother who nurtured them. The same society that once feared daughters was now told to treasure them, to see in them not weakness, but a path to divine mercy. This was radical. This was dangerous. And yet, it was irresistible, because truth has a way of haunting the guilty. Picture the faces of men who had once buried their newborns in secret, now hearing that the earth itself would testify against them. Picture the relief of mothers who at last had a voice on their side, a promise that their grief was not forgotten. The desert, once filled with silence, was now filled with words that would never be buried. This was the turning point, a moment when an entire civilization was forced to confront its shadows, and when the forgotten baby girls of Arabia were finally remembered. For centuries, the desert tried to keep its secret. The wind blew across dunes that hid the graves of nameless girls, and history almost let them vanish without a trace. But their silence was never complete. It waited for us. The story of Arabia's buried daughters is not just about the past. It is about how easily societies can justify cruelty when pride and fear outweigh compassion. These girls were not lost because of weakness. They were lost because their world refused to see their worth, and that is why their story matters. Think about it. If not for the voice of revelation, if not for the message carried by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, how many more centuries would the sand have swallowed? How many more mothers would have cried in secret? How many more daughters would have been erased before their lives began? But here's the haunting truth. While Arabia's practice ended, the lesson is not trapped in the past. Even today, around the world, girls are still denied education, still treated as burdens, still silenced before they can reach their potential. Some are not buried in sand, but in poverty, in neglect, in violence. Different methods, the same cruelty. That is why remembering Arabia's forgotten baby girls is more than history. It is a warning. It asks us, how do we treat the most vulnerable among us? Do we see their value, or do we let fear, pride, and selfishness bury them in other ways? And yet, this story is also about hope. A society once defined by silence was transformed by words. Words that still echo today. Words that told fathers to love their daughters, that told mothers their grief was heard, that told humanity that no life is worthless. Those words pulled a civilization out of darkness and into something bright. So the next time you hear the winds of the desert in your imagination, remember what they carry. Not just the whispers of forgotten cries, but the reminder that change is possible, that even the most entrenched cruelty can be overturned, that the silenced can still speak through us. Because history isn't just about kings and wars, it's about the ones who were nearly erased, and our responsibility to keep their memory alive. The buried girls of Arabia never got to grow, to laugh, to love. But by telling their story, we give them something they were denied, a voice. And now, their story is in your hands. If this opened your eyes to a hidden truth of history, then don't let it fade here. Like this video to honor the memory of those who were silenced. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden side of our past. And share in the comments what struck you the most about their fate. Because when we remember the forgotten, we keep their light alive. And in doing so, we make sure the sand no longer hides their secret.